Have you ever sat down to do one important thing and somehow ended up doing everything except that thing? You open your laptop because you need to finish something. Then you remember a message you forgot to reply to. While replying, you notice another notification. That reminds you of something you wanted to search for. You open a new tab, then somehow your phone is in your hand. 20 minutes later, you look back at the thing you originally sat down to do. It is still there, untouched. And now you are frustrated. Not only because you lost time, but because a familiar question starts creeping in. Why can't I just focus? And when this keeps happening, it becomes easy to make the problem personal. Maybe I am lazy. Maybe I lack discipline. Maybe I am just someone who starts things but struggles to stay with them. And perhaps that is the most frustrating part. It is not always that the thing in front of you does not matter. Sometimes it matters a lot. You genuinely want to give it your attention, which makes it even more confusing when your mind refuses to stay where you want it. And after it happens enough times, the question slowly changes from, why did I get distracted, to, what is wrong with me? But before you turn that frustration into another reason to criticize yourself, I want you to consider something. What if your biggest problem is not that you cannot focus? What if your attention has simply become accustomed to leaving? And if that is true, the answer is not necessarily more motivation. It is learning how to return. But before we get to that, we need to understand why focus has become so difficult in the first place. First, let me make something clear. Women are not naturally worse at focusing. This video is speaking to women because that is who we are building for here at She Builds Within. But the problem itself is human. And one of the biggest reasons focus has become difficult is that much of modern life trains us to switch. Your attention is constantly moving. Something changes, something appears, something needs checking. Something else becomes more interesting. None of these moments feels serious by itself, but repeated often enough, switching becomes familiar. Staying becomes harder. That distinction matters, because many people think they have an attention problem when what they may actually have is a well-practiced switching habit. You have become efficient at changing direction. Then you sit down with something that requires depth, something that will not entertain you every few seconds, something that asks you to remain with the same problem long enough to think properly. And after a while, your mind begins looking for movement again, not because the work does not matter, not because you do not want the outcome, but because sustained attention is asking your mind to behave differently from the way it has been behaving for most of the day. Constant switching also has a hidden cost. Each time you leave a task, your mind has to find its way back into it. You have to remember where you were, recover the thoughts you were developing, and rebuild the concentration that had already begun. That repeated restarting can make ordinary work feel much more exhausting than it should. Sometimes the tiredness you blame on the task is partly the cost of repeatedly leaving it. That is the first reason focus becomes difficult. The second is novelty. New information naturally competes for attention. The task you have been working on for 20 minutes is familiar now. The notification is new. The thought that suddenly appeared is new. The thing you could quickly search for promises new information. So distraction often feels more interesting than the thing you already decided to do. This is why meaningful work may feel slow. It asks you to stay through the part where nothing exciting is happening yet before the reward arrives. And this is where people often misunderstand motivation. You can be highly motivated about the outcome and still be distracted during the process. You can desperately want the qualification and still struggle to study. You can want financial independence and still postpone learning about your money. You can care deeply about a project and still find yourself searching for something easier when the work becomes demanding. Motivation answers the question, why do I want this? Focus answers a different question. Can I stay with this long enough to do something meaningful? Those are not the same skill. And there is a third reason we lose focus that I think is even more important. Sometimes distraction is relief. The task becomes difficult. You are unsure whether your work is good enough. You reach a part that requires more thinking. Then suddenly doing something else feels very attractive, not necessarily because the other thing is more important, because it gives you somewhere easier to go. And this is where a little compassion matters. Avoidance is not always proof that you do not care enough. Sometimes the task matters so much that uncertainty, fear of getting it wrong, or the pressure to do it well makes it emotionally heavier. Distraction then becomes a moment of relief. Understanding that does not excuse avoidance. It helps you address what is really happening instead of turning it into another judgment about who you are. That is why removing every notification does not completely solve distraction. Even in a quiet room, your own mind can interrupt you. And if you automatically follow every thought that appears, your focus still breaks. So the real problem is not simply that distractions exist. Distractions will always exist. The more important question is, what have you trained yourself to do when one appears? And before I show you the simple magic habit that changes that, I want to ask you something. What usually breaks your focus first? Is it your phone? Your own thoughts? Other people? Or the moment the work starts becoming difficult? Tell me in the comments. And if these conversations are helping you become more intentional with your time, your money, your confidence, and the life you are building, subscribe to She Builds Within. Now here is the habit. I call it capture and return. It sounds almost too simple, but that simplicity is exactly what makes it useful. When you sit down to do something that requires focus, keep a blank piece of paper beside you. You can use a notebook too. At the top of the page, write one word. Later. Then begin your work. Eventually, something will happen. Your mind will wander. You will suddenly remember something that genuinely needs your attention. Instead of immediately leaving your task, write it on the page. That is the capture. Then go back to what you were doing. That is the return. Capture, return. That is the entire habit. You are not trying to stop thoughts from appearing. You are changing your response to them. And psychologically, that is a very different experience. Because one reason we follow distracting thoughts is that they feel urgent. Your mind says, deal with this now. Capture removes some of that pressure. The thought has somewhere to go. You are not ignoring it. You are postponing it intentionally. And then you return to the thing you already decided mattered. The real power of this habit is not the paper. It is what you are teaching your mind. You are teaching yourself that noticing something does not mean you have to act on it immediately. A thought can exist without becoming an instruction. That is powerful, because every time your attention wanders and you deliberately bring it back, you are practicing focus. The wandering is not the failure, the return is the training. That is the part I really want you to understand. A focused person is not necessarily someone whose mind never wanders. She has simply become better at coming back, and once you understand that, you no longer need the perfect mood. You do not need to wait until you feel unusually disciplined. You do not need to promise yourself that you will concentrate flawlessly for 2 hours. You only need a response prepared for the moment distraction appears. Capture it. Return. There is another advantage to this habit. Your later page starts revealing what actually breaks your concentration. After a few sessions, look at what you wrote down. You may begin to notice patterns. Perhaps the same kinds of thoughts appear whenever the work becomes difficult. Perhaps you constantly remember small tasks because you have nowhere reliable to store them. Perhaps the urge to switch becomes strongest when you are uncertain about what to do next. Now you are no longer simply saying, I am easily distracted. You are beginning to understand your distraction, and that is much more useful. Because once you know what repeatedly pulls you away, you can start changing the conditions around it. There is also one small practice I would pair with capture and return. Become slightly more comfortable with unstimulated moments. Not every empty minute needs to be filled. Sometimes allow yourself to wait, to walk, to sit for a few minutes without immediately reaching for more information. This matters because if your attention spends the entire day moving from stimulus to stimulus, asking it to suddenly become still for serious work will always feel harder. You do not need to become extreme about it. You are simply reminding your mind that nothing terrible happens when nothing new is arriving. And this is where focus becomes much bigger than productivity. Because your attention is involved in almost everything you are trying to build. Your ability to learn depends on whether you can stay with something long enough to understand it. Your career benefits when you can give difficult work sustained attention. Your finances improve when you can sit down and understand what is actually happening with your money, instead of avoiding it. Your goals move when they receive more than the scattered pieces of attention left after everything else has taken its share. Even your relationships change when the person in front of you receives your actual presence. Where your attention repeatedly goes, part of your life goes with it. Your attention is also more personal than a productivity tool. It is one of the ways you decide what receives your thinking, your patience, and your presence. Every day, countless things compete for a piece of it. Reclaiming focus is not about squeezing work out of every free minute. It is about becoming more deliberate about what is worthy of having you fully present. That is why I do not think the answer is another motivational speech about trying harder. Maybe you have been trying. Maybe the frustration comes precisely because you care. What you need is a better response to the moment your mind inevitably moves. Capture what needs to wait. Return to what matters now. Do that often enough, and focus stops becoming something you either have or do not have. It becomes something you know how to practice. If this message spoke to you, comment, "My attention belongs to me." Like this video if it helped you understand your focus differently, and share it with someone who has been struggling to concentrate, especially someone who keeps blaming themselves for not being motivated enough. Subscribe to She Builds Within for more conversations about personal development, wealth, confidence, discipline, purpose, independence, and becoming more intentional with the life you are building. And remember, focus is not built by never wandering. It is built by learning how to return. Because what you repeatedly return to is eventually what you give enough of yourself to build.